All right, let's keep reading Dr. I keep saying doctor. There I go. Professor Holtberg. Now there's a question that's been put forward to see, I do it again. To Professor Holtberg about the book that he wrote, and we're having this discussion on whether or not the rapture is real and its relevance for Christians, and which view more accurately describes the timing of the rapture in relation to the 7-year last 7 years of human history. This is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi, in case you're just tuning in. Here's a question that's been put forward to Professor Holtberg. In your introduction to 3 views on the rapture, you say that while the issue of the timing of the rapture isn't central to the Christian faith, it touches on the doctrine of the church and on issues of normative Christian experience, and is thus not an inconsequential doctrine, but one that the church at large needs continually to wrestle with. Why is this issue an important one for Christians to discuss? All right, let's let him answer that particular question. Remember, this is an interview from Biola magazine. This was conducted back in 2012. Here's what Professor Holtberg had to say. Well, when I say that the doctrine of the rapture touches on the doctrine of the church, I mean that the distinction made among believers by the rapture raises the question of the relation of various groups of believers in the larger family of God. He goes on to say, the Bible teaches that some believers will go through the period of God's wrath, notably the 144,000 in Revelation 7, 9, and 14, and some won't. And he goes on to say that the us that Paul associates himself with in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, those who will be raptured. So let me interject for a moment without going too deep into this particular aspect. When you read through the book of Revelation, there's this group that's introduced that was not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. They only show up in the book of Revelation. The 144,000, the famous or infamous, if you're following along with, like, say, Mormon theology or Jehovah's Witnesses or one of those other groups that uses 144,000 in their theology in a kind of a strange way. Well, this group shows up in the book of Revelation, and they show up prior to this group that also shows up in heaven that is described as having come out of tribulation. And so by most rapture proponents, myself included, this group that shows up in Revelation chapter 7 that we're talking about is the raptured church. And yet, prior to that, the 144,000 is mentioned. So if they're showing up on earth as being marked out by God, and yet they don't get raptured, the question can be asked, are they saved? We know they're Jewish, right? They're 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. But are they saved? If the answer is yes, then the next question would be, why didn't they get raptured? Professor Holtberg says that they are believers. He says the Bible teaches that some believers will go through the period of God's wrath, and yet some won't, meaning the 144,000 are believers, but they don't get raptured with the rest of the church. They stay here on earth and go through the wrath of God, or the tribulation, if you want to call it, if you're a pre-tribber. So that's a different topic. At the moment, I'm not dealing with that. I'm only dealing with rapture. What is it? When will it happen? We'll turn into a heavier discussion on who are the 144,000 and why they don't get raptured and things like that in time. So this is just to whet your appetite. Let's keep going with Professor Holtberg. So why is there this distinction among believers? What does it have to teach us about the family of God? And this is an important part for us to consider, because we're talking about a topic that impacts not just believers, but we're talking about a topic that impacts Israel saved and Israel unsaved, both parts of Israel. Remember, most of Israel right now is in rebellion against God and his Messiah, even though they don't describe themselves in rebellion. But from God's perspective, because they are in blindness, then therefore they are in rejection of their Messiah. And so rapture is going to impact them, but in a way that they're probably not expecting. Also, rapture and resurrection are definitely going to impact the world at large, and we'll eventually talk about what type of impact that's going to have on them. So But primarily rapture is, as you could probably assume, rapture is primarily for the Christian church. What does Professor Holtberg say? When I say it touches on the issues of normative Christian experience, so it is primarily a Christian discussion, I mean that it raises the question of God allowing the church to suffer. So he counts those 144,000 along with Christian church, Christian believers, but wonders why God would allow them to suffer and yet not rapture them. There's debate over the timing of the rapture in relation to the final tribulation, he says, the final period of unparalleled persecution by the Antichrist. Some argue that God will not allow the church to suffer under Antichrist. But, he mentions, God does allow the church to suffer in this present age, right? Recall John 16:33, Acts 14:22. So what makes the difference if there is one? And it's an important issue for us to discuss, especially if, remember, according to the post-trib rapture perspective, and this time I think I will pull that second chart so you can see. Let me just scroll up a bit and you'll see the chart that I'm referring to. We looked at this in times past. Here we go. In the post-trib rapture, using this particular chart, this is one of the views of the post-trib rapture. Notice that in this representation of post-trib, the entire 7 years is essentially identified as God's wrath, even though it's broken up into 3.5 years, labeled tribulation on the first half and great tribulation on the second half. Nevertheless, the church is not raptured until the 7 years has run its course, meaning on this chart, post-trib rapture and second coming are synonymous with one another. They're conflated. They're right on top of one another. They're the same thing, essentially. We go up and then we quickly come right back down after being transformed from old bodies into new bodies, basically, is the point. But germane to my focus at the moment, as we're reading through Professor Holtberg's notes here and his interview with Viola magazine, germane to my the point I'm trying to focus on or highlight is that God's wrath / tribulation is experienced by Christians. So how can that be? What does God do? Is he actually punishing his children? Remember, God's wrath is a form of retribution, a form of punishment, a form of God saying to wicked humanity, enough is enough, right? You've thumbed your nose, you've thumbed your nose at my ways, at my words, at my truths. You have rejected my Messiah. You've turned your back on him. You've run your wicked course, and enough is enough. And so God has to pour out judgment on wicked humanity and also on the man of sin himself and his kingdom that is going to be dominating planet Earth during this time. The Antichrist will at this point in time have established his own beast empire on Earth again, and he'll be ruling and reigning, and mass chaos will be the order of the day. There'll be a return to demonic signs and wonders, and great deception will be plaguing humanity, although they will also be enjoying what is described by the Bible as a measure of peace and safety because of the Antichrist's protection on those who take the mark of the beast. So tribulation will be primarily aimed at Jews and Christians because the Antichrist hates Jews and Christians and anyone who opposes him, but primarily hates Jews and Christians. So the point I'm bringing up is, how will God at the same time pour out wrath and punishment on wicked humanity and yet be able to at the same time protect his own children to some degree from his own wrath that will be poured out? Well, there are several examples in the Bible where this has been done before, namely the plagues in Egypt, where God protected Israel while at the same time pouring out the plagues on Egypt. He did it there, right? Had the Israelites kind of protected in Goshen. So we call that option Goshen principle. But there are other passages that seem to hint at this idea that God is going to supernaturally protect some of his people, or at least all of his people, while he pours out wrath. Not least of which is in the book of Revelation, in relationship to Israel, God tells her to flee into the wilderness where he has a place prepared for her for 1,260 days, which is at least 3.5 years. So it's probably during the Great Tribulation that Israel will also enjoy a measure of protection from the wrath of the Antichrist, if not also protection from the wrath of God himself, which would seem to make sense. But that's Israel. So, and that's, by the way, my reference is Revelation chapter 12. Let's go back and keep reading Professor Holtberg's notes. There's another topic that's being introduced here by the Biola staff. There are three main views of the timing of the rapture: pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, and pre-wrath. Could you briefly explain the main claims of each position? This is why, again, this is part of my introduction part, my overview of the rapture as a topic. Let's listen to Professor Holtberg's answer. Remember, he wrote a book on the three views of the rapture, and it's the second edition that we're primarily referencing because of the pre-wrath position that Professor Holtberg holds to is now the position that is more popular than the mid-trib. Originally, it was pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, and now it's pre-trib, pre-wrath, and post-trib. Here's what he has to say. The pre-tribulation view teaches that God will rapture the church before the final 7 years of this age, often called the 70th week of Daniel from Daniel 9:27, or the tribulation. According to this view, this entire time period is characterized by God's wrath. We saw that slide there earlier. It depends in part on making a distinction between the coming of Christ to rapture the church and the coming of Christ to return to earth to reign. Let me interject and show you another slide that's relevant to what we're talking about. So on my slides that have all of my, that have all of my graphics. On the left side of what you're looking at now of a table, there's two columns. The left column has the label rapture, and this is the description of Jesus coming on the clouds to meet his church, to meet his bride. He stops in the air and he brings his people up to himself. God's people get glorified bodies. So we're talking about rapture/resurrection. And then judgment and the wrath of God begins with the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, and the wicked of humanity are allowed 3.5 years. And then, so we're talking about something that takes place according to this time frame. Takes place more along the lines of not a pre-trib model, but more of either a mid-trib or a pre-wrath model when we're talking about rapture, because it talks about judgment and wrath begin with the 7 trumpets. We could say this could be pre-trib if we just remember that rapture takes place before the 7 years at all. But the last line reads that the Antichrist and false prophets are allowed 3.5 more years. So that's the rapture. By comparison, the right table has the second coming being Jesus coming on a horse. So we're talking about Revelation chapter 19 now. Jesus coming on a horse. Jesus comes completely on down to earth. His feet touch down, right? Mount of Olives. Zechariah chapter 14, as well as Revelation chapter 19. Jesus brings his people with him. According to some views, Revelation chapter 19 talks about Jesus coming with those who are wearing white robes. And this could be the church. It might not be the church. There's debate there. We'll talk about that in time. God's people have their glorified bodies, definitely, because the marriage supper of the Lamb took place earlier in Revelation chapter 19. And then we read about the Battle of Armageddon that we're describing where Jesus comes back. The judgment and wrath of God conclude at this battle, known as the Battle of Armageddon, and which may or may not even take place in the Valley of Megiddo. It might take place because there's no true mountain called Har Megiddo, in case you didn't know. That's just the valley name, but a mountain called Megiddo, as in Har Mountain Megiddo, Megiddon, I'm sorry, not Megiddo, Megiddon, Har Megiddon, where we get our English word Armageddon. There's a case made by Joel Richardson that this likely isn't taking place in the place that we describe as the Valley of Megiddo, which is north and west of Israel, I think about like 20 miles, but is instead, according to texts in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the location of this battle should be actually Jerusalem. All right, right? In fact, Jesus touches down on Jerusalem, so why would he have to touch down on Jerusalem and then walk to, or ride his horse that he's going to come back on? Ride his horse to Megiddo, 20 miles away? It doesn't make sense. We'll talk about that in time. But nevertheless, second coming is Jesus coming back and coming all the way back down to earth. So that's in contrast to rapture, where he doesn't touch down. But Battle of Armageddon is the time frame, and then Antichrist and false prophet are captured and cast into the lake of fire. The devil's captured and sealed in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. So whether you believe that rapture and wrath are separated by 7 years, by 3.5 years, by a shorter time period like pre-wrath, or they're right on top of one another, they are still two events. There's no way to get around that. The rapid upwards movement and the rapid downward movement are definitely pictured in Scripture, and the language that is attached to each of these events is enough to describe them as two separate events, no matter how much time you put between the two events, no matter which view you hold to. They're still two separate events. We go up and then we come back down, even if it's within a few seconds of one another. We're still going up first. We can't deny that. There is still a resurrection. We can't deny that. We can't rip that part out of Scripture because we don't like this idea of rapture. We have to hold to that. Let's go back to Professor Holtberg's interview notes. So he's talking about making a distinction between the coming of Christ to rapture the church and the coming of Christ to return to earth. And I might add that, and this is actually a very important point that I believe he's going to make, when we're talking about the second coming of Christ, I believe it is necessary to identify the second coming as one event. And even though there are one time frame, which includes two events, so even though we have rapture on one end of that time frame, one of the duration of that prophesied coming, right? The parousia is what we're talking about. Even though we have one thing called the second coming, one parousia, we do have rapture on the front end kicking off the parousia, and second coming on the back end, more or less concluding the parousia. And it's the duration of the parousia, or the coming, that is debatable. So I think that's the best way to describe the event known as the second coming, or the parousia, the coming of Messiah. Let's keep reading Professor Holtberg's notes. We've got about 15 minutes left, and looks like we might be able to finish this blog and then turn right back around and look at those passages that he inserted, those prominent passages. He goes on to say that post-tribulationism, so he just talked about pre-trib, right? Let me back up and show you. He said pre-trib view teaches that God will rapture the church before the final 7 years of this age. But by comparison, post-tribulationism teaches that the church will be raptured at the very end of the age when Christ returns to reign. Meaning, in the post-trib view, God has to supernaturally protect his children from the wrath that he's going to pour out, and at the same time allow them to go through the tribulation of Antichrist, the wrath of Satan, but supernaturally protect them from his own wrath, which is going to be happening simultaneously at the same time as the wrath of Satan, according to the post-trib view, at least one of the post-trib views. Remember, and I apologize, I have to jump back to the chart again. Remember, according to, let me show you, according to this chart, the post-trib, which is in the lower left corner, the post-trib on this chart puts the rapture and the second coming at the far right at the end of the 7 years. And what does that do with the day of the Lord? And sorry, it turns it into a short 24-hour time period according to this particular model that we're looking at. Meaning the day of the Lord is a scant 1 day. It's a real day. It's a literal day. When we say the day of the Lord, it's only 24 hours long. I believe, if I remember, Joel Richardson holds to this particular view of rapture. He calls it a hybrid model. I'll flash a little graphic on the screen in post-production that actually shows his model that he calls hybrid. So he calls it hybrid because he believes that the church will actually be raptured prior to the day of the Lord being poured out, just like this little graphic shows, meaning it is a pre-wrath rapture, but it is also a post-trib, meaning we Christians go through the entire tribulation, 7 years, and then they get raptured prior to the day of the Lord being poured out. I believe that's the view, if I remember, that he holds to. But there are other proponents of the post-trib view that believe, notice on this view, this model, the 7 years is still the same. The rapture is still at the far right of the post-trib view, the one on the bottom. But notice what happened to the wrath of God. It jumped on the left side of rapture, whereas on this model, the DOTL, day of the Lord, i.e. the wrath of God, is on the right side of the rapture. So see what's happening? There's at least 3 different views of the post-trib that I'm working from, meaning it's not an agreed upon. They have not yet decided on what to do with the day of the Lord. Do we get sheltered through it? Does God protect us supernaturally? And we go through all of it, all tribulation, all of the wrath of God, and then the rapture takes place at the far end? Is that what happens? Or do we get raptured just before the day of the Lord is poured out in a 24-hour fashion? Or does the wrath of God run the entire 3.5-year course? We go through it, we get supernaturally sheltered, and then the rapture takes place at the far end, like this model shows. Or, I'll show you that last one. Or is it more like this post-trib model, where God's wrath runs the entire 7-year time frame? The tribulation and great tribulation more or less also occupy that same time frame of the 7 years, although they are disconnected by, or they're designated trib and great trib, 3.5 and 3.5 years respectively. But nevertheless, God's people have to go through wrath in this model, and the post-trib rapture and second coming are at the far right, like every other post-trib model. So as you can see, post-trib hasn't agreed upon where the wrath of God takes place and what, if any, happens to Christians during that time frame.